Hello, I'm LemonBread. Thief. Video games are expensive, both in terms of cost to buy and to make. But with games being typically $50, $60, $70, $80 now, it begs the question, why not have this for free? You see, these expensive games can take millions and millions of dollars to produce, so of course the developers would want to see the game have positive returns for their hard work, and frankly, they should. But how can they expect to make those returns in the first place if those greedy pirate bastards keep stealing their games? What can be done to stop this? Death threats. Anti-Piracy, the act of preventing cargo from getting stolen and commerce from getting interrupted at sea. Shit, wrong article, hold on. Anti-Piracy, the act of preventing cargo from getting stolen and commerce from getting interrupted at sea. It's a common practice in gaming, and has been that way for many years at this point, for better or for worse. For one, it ensures that developers aren't getting robbed of any lost sales from their games because of pirates. No matter the quality of a game, developers often have to work long hours to make it a reality. The best we could do is give them a living wage. However, anti-piracy is generally remembered for being invasive, inconvenient, inefficient, and in many cases downright incapable of actually taking down pirates. Which is why I'm here to talk about it and try to make sense of this. Starting with this hunk of junk. You see, piracy and copy protection have existed for many years, nearly as long as PC consumer software for that matter. Despite the fact that software and video games were still distributed on cassette tapes and floppy disks at the time, piracy was still a decently big problem for game devs, and some of the earliest forms of anti-piracy can be found at this time. Since putting in software anti-piracy would be nigh on impossible on a cassette tape though, developers had to find a workaround that would make playing video games on a copy tape impossible. And this is where we see some of the earliest forms of physical anti-piracy, a sign of the times when it comes to copy protection. The idea is simple. If you can't put anti-piracy within the cassette, why not put it outside of the cassette? By locking access to a video game behind some secret code in the game manual or some other form of physical encryption, pirates would be forced to painstakingly recreate the encryption through some other means, or else the game would be impossible to be played, making it harder for the game to be shared around. One of the first games to incorporate this method, released in 1984, was Jet Set Willy, which was a standout video game as it was the first to include a modern art piece alongside it. The concept was, when you'd boot up the game, you'd be faced with a prompt asking you to input specific colors on a numbered grid included with the game, which would be extremely difficult to replicate as, back then, color photocopiers weren't as commonplace, and writing down each individual color for each individual square would be extremely tedious. A workaround was soon found out pretty quickly afterwards, but for a while it was very difficult to replicate this game. As software shifted from cassettes to floppy disks, however, anti-piracy methods, especially physical ones, would have to follow closely behind in order to circumvent illegal copying. Of course, arguably the most notable early example of physical anti-piracy is The Secret of Monkey Island, a 1990 MS-DOS game released around the time piracy was actually starting to become a big problem. This so-called dial-a-pirate system subjected the players to horrors incomprehensible before having recreate it using a cardboard disc and input a code revealed through the face. This is probably the most famous and memorable form of anti-piracy from these days, among other code wheel systems, but there were a handful of other weird forms of it at the time. More often than not, most PC games would just have you input a word or character from a certain section of the game manual, so if you are someone who only ever kept the disc of a game, I'm sorry. Other games, such as certain Zork games, came with feelies that contained vital information needed to progress, which you wouldn't get with a pirated copy. Then you have other systems like LensLock, one of the more interesting forms of physical anti-piracy. Prior to the invention of the dial-a-pirate service, this system involved the player inputting a corrupted code shown on screen that could only be revealed in its true form through the prismatic LensLock device. Now, if you are none the wiser and you booted up your game just to see this, you probably would assume something was deeply wrong. So it's probably for that reason that it was only used in a handful of games, since it almost encroaches on affecting non-pirates' experiences as well. Put a pin in that for later. As piracy evolved though, the need for more efficient forms of anti-piracy evolved as well. I mean, hell, if pirates could circumvent Jet Set Willy, what could they do next? And alongside its inefficiency and inefficacy, as well as the increasing popularity of CD-ROMs for games, physical anti-piracy fell to the wayside, meaning that other forms of anti-piracy would have to evolve to this changing landscape. Now, most PC games distributed on discs these days have a serial key code to it. It's admittedly pretty boring. I mean, nothing can truly top Dial-A-Pirate, but it works. So long as it's not like Windows 95 where nothing but ones can bypass the serial key, then it's by far the most rampant form of anti-piracy for physical PC games. Physical PC games, because so far I've only talked about PC games delivered on physical media. Floppy disks, cassette tapes, CD-ROMs, etc. What I've neglected to mention is that all of these forms of media are obsolete. You're not gonna have to worry about feelies not being included with your game. Instead, you're gonna have to worry about a much bigger problem. Darn. Ever since the advent of online distribution for games, pirates have been quick to follow closely behind. Hell, long before the introduction of software like BitTorrent, online piracy has been a problem since the 80s on things like bulletin board systems, and since you can't necessarily recreate the feasibility of serial keys or feelies with online distribution, other methods had to be put in place to prevent pirates from plundering priced products online. Of course, the most effective form of online anti-piracy is to simply release your game on a digital storefront. It's the strategy Valve has been doing for 20 plus years at this point, successfully too. By including basic features such as automatic updates, faster download speeds, and achievements, Steam has become the de facto storefront for pretty much most AAA or indie PC games, since these are things that you won't necessarily get with a pirated copy. And since most Steam games on sale are dirt cheap anyways, there's not really a point in pirating some of these games when you can get all of them for a nickel. There are other storefronts too, I guess. Now this is all well and good, don't get me wrong. In a perfect world, every game released would be on Steam and anti-piracy would be a thing of the past. And to that I say, have you seen the news recently? DRM has become a popular solution for many AAA developers when releasing their games online. For worse or for... no. For worse. Even Steam, which is its own form of DRM in its own right, isn't immune to it, and this has stirred a lot of controversy online due to the inherent issues with DRM. By far the biggest problems, for PC games that is DRM that negatively impacts the performance of a game or non-pirates' experiences. Always on DRM is a pretty major example of the latter, forcing the user to remain connected to a certain server every time they want to play a game, even single-player ones, essentially resting the crux of an entire game's availability on a single server that can shut down at any moment. And half the time, it doesn't even work! Then you have programs such as Denuvo, which have been shown to slow down video games or hog CPU usage unnecessarily. The reasons to hate DRM go on and on and on, but unfortunately, until a better way to circumvent pirates is found for these companies, or even needed in the first place, then DRM is likely going to be around for the foreseeable future. For PC games, that is, because for console games, it's a much different story. Fuck! As shocking as it may seem, piracy has affected way more platforms than just the PC. Things like mod chipping, emulation, and free ROM websites have long plagued video game consoles. Now, the earliest forms of anti-piracy I could find on consoles lie within the NES. There may be even earlier examples before this, I just couldn't find any. The NES was a very innovative console of its day. It revitalized the floundering video game industry within the States, invented concepts like licensing third-party games that are still standard amongst game companies, and also spread anti-piracy to the masses. Thanks, Nintendo. You see, the original Famicom, as it was released in Japan, lacked certain hardware features that prevented unauthorized software from being played on the system, so when it came to releasing the NES worldwide, more care was taken into making sure that this wouldn't be possible. The 10 NES lockout chip was Nintendo's solution, which required third-party developers to go through an extensive process to make their games playable. This was mainly designed to prevent bootleg and shovelware titles from being released on the NES, not like it helped much anyways, but many still point to it being the first major form of anti-piracy in consoles. There's a reason why you don't see a lot of bootlegs for the NES compared to the Famicom. It wasn't until the 5th and 6th generation that anti-piracy would begin to look more sophisticated. Now, of course, cartridges were still the dominant medium for games at this time, so anti-piracy would mostly have to be baked within the cartridge itself. A popular form of anti-piracy on these platforms would be to simply check a byte of data to see if the game was legitimate or not, and if this failed, that meant the game was likely running on some external pirating hardware, and some form of copy protection would kick in. checksums, as they're called, have been around for a time before this, but I think really started to take their own during the SNES and N64 era. It's also during this time that anti-piracy screens began to become more popular, but that's another story. As the 90s went on, however, the way of playing video games shifted from cartridges to CD-ROMs, which were cheaper and could hold more data. However, because CDs are relatively easy to write to, CD-based consoles would have to get more creative with their anti-piracy methods. One of the first CD-ROM based consoles, the 3DO, got really creative for its anti-piracy. It didn't have any. I guess this was just in an era where CD burning wasn't as widespread, so I reckon the 3DO company either didn't realize how popular it would become, or just neglected to include it since they felt it was unnecessary. Either way, it's pretty easy to play burnt CDs on the 3DO. Whether or not they'll work correctly is another story, but if you're curious as to how it works, I recommend some of FrameRaider's videos on the subject. They go way more in depth on it than I ever could. So the 3DO didn't have any anti-piracy. See how that worked out for them. It became clear to this that CD-ROMs weren't free from the same amount of scrutiny that other cartridge-based consoles had. So when the next major CD-ROM based console, the PS1, came out, more measures had to be enacted. You see, anti-piracy on the PS1 is pretty fascinating. Now, PS1 discs themselves aren't really anything special. Apart from the fact that they're black on the reverse, they function pretty much the exact same as any other CD-ROM out there. If you put them into a CD player, it'd just start playing the soundtrack of the game like any other CD. What's special about PS1 CDs is this wobble frequency contained within the pre-gap of the disc, which could be preloaded with code specifically read by the PlayStation 1. No wobble frequency, and the game doesn't load. And because the wobble couldn't be read from a typical CD drive, that meant that duplicating it was nigh on impossible. For what it's worth, it's a particularly detailed and secure way of preventing copyright infringement on the PS1. There are some problems, however. It's not perfect, nothing is after all, but it isn't too difficult to bypass the wobble detection by disc swapping an official PS1 game with a ripped PS1 game at the right time. But because of the damage this could cause to both the disc and the console, soon people began turning to mod chips instead. These are custom chips that would in essence trick the console into running software that was burnt or from a different region. Now, with something that you'd have to actually solder and mod into the system, most average consumers likely didn't even bother or hell even know about these mod chips, but nevertheless they were popular enough to warrant extra anti-piracy features being included in later PS1 games. And these mod chips weren't in isolation in the 5th generation either, as now mod chips exist for pretty much every console that exists on the market today, making them a still popular form of piracy amongst game consoles. As the 90s progressed, other companies like Sega and Atari would soon jump on the CD-ROM trend, and consoles like the Sega Saturn wound up having similar anti-piracy measures to the PlayStation 1. It seems as if game companies were finally ready to take the plunge on this new CD-ROM technology. Except one. The big N, Nintendo 64, was notable for being one of the only consoles of the 5th generation to use cartridges instead of CDs, putting it up there with the likes of the Atari Jaguar, 32X, and Virtual Boy. The main reason why Nintendo stuck with the cartridge format are the faster loading times associated with the format, and the fact that, at least back then, N64 cartridges were far harder to replicate. It's also one of the main reasons why the N64 wasn't as successful as the PS1, but that's besides the point. The N64 is still one of the most secure consoles of its day. And it goes beyond just using cartridges as well, as these cartridges also contained a better refined lockout chip akin to the ones used in the NES and SNES, and many individual games contained additional anti-piracy measures to seal the deal. Rareware was especially keen on making sure that pirates suffered when it came to copying their games, as games like Banjo-Tooie or Perfect Dark contain ludicrous amounts of checks to make pirates' experiences as frustrating as possible. Put a pin in that for later, again. And it kinda worked. Compared to the PS1, the N64 was way more secure than those CD-ROMs, so that's right, fuck you, Sony. Oh. Cartridges were just not it. Like I said, the disadvantages inherent with the cartridge format vastly outweigh any of the advantages of it. Sure, it's secure. Sure, it can load things faster than a PS1 CD. Sure, it's more durable than a CD-ROM. But 64 megabytes on a cartridge compared to 700 on a single CD-ROM ain't gonna cut it. And as more and more game companies shifted away from Nintendo onto the PS1, Nintendo would have to catch up with their next console, the GameCube, which featured an all-new DVD format on par with the other game companies, and son of a bitch. The 6th generation had ushered in a new era for video gaming. By now, the transition from 2D to 3D had already been perfected and expanded, games with higher quality and consoles with higher specs were becoming the norm, and the Dreamcast was the very first console to signal this paradigm shift. The Dreamcast, the saddest console, initially hyped up to be one of the biggest advances in gaming technology, ultimately it floundered compared to the other consoles of its day. Even the GameCube, widely seen as a disappointment by Nintendo standards, ran laps around it. But it did have one thing most of the other consoles didn't have: increased security. Its proprietary GD-ROM technology, GD standing for Gigabyte Disk, fulfilled a number of criteria for Sega. It gave developers more freedom thanks to its increased storage, was cheaper to produce than the then fledgling DVD format, and could easily thwart pirates because of its proprietary formatting. On an unrelated note, ever played Choo Choo Rocket? Know how I said the Dreamcast had security? Yeah, it is shockingly easy to pirate for the Dreamcast, almost comically so, if it weren't so damn depressing. It all boils down to how the Dreamcast handles MIL-CDs, or Music Interactive Live CDs. These were standard CD-ROMs that, when placed into a Dreamcast, unlocked certain multimedia features, essentially turning the Dreamcast into a karaoke machine. It was only ever used for 8 Japanese exclusive albums before being discontinued not long after. But because most international Dreamcast models could run MIL-CDs, that meant that, by proxy, it could run code directly from standard CDRs. And because of the lack of security in the MIL-CD format, it wasn't long before an exploit was found allowing you to boot pretty much any Dreamcast game from a standard CDR. You could theoretically have an entire collection of Dreamcast games of nothing but blank CDs, which to me sounds utterly miserable, but with how expensive some of these games can be, I wouldn't blame you. And Sega was not having it, as soon after the exploit was found, Sega began a relentless campaign of sending cease and desist orders to pirates before outright removing MIL-CD compatibility from future Dreamcasts. Other game companies would soon follow suit, introducing harsher anti-piracy into some of their games. But by then, it was too little too late. The PlayStation 2 had already been released in Japan at that point and was headed towards a worldwide release, and the competition from it proved to be far too fierce for Sega. They discontinued the Dreamcast after only 3 years on the market, and though there were plans for a DVD-compatible version of the Dreamcast, it never materialized, leading Sega to be the only console of the 6th generation to not adopt DVDs. But you know what company did adopt DVDs? You want to hear a joke? The GameCube, one of the boldest consoles of its time. It's a fucking shape. In an attempt to make the GameCube seem more like a viable competitor compared to its contemporaries, it was positioned more as a big boy console. Nintendo was keen to publish more mature titles for the system. Their own games like Twilight Princess or Metroid Prime featured darker and edgier aesthetics, and it was far greater in processing power compared to the N64. And one of the aspects of the GameCube that signaled this paradigm shift was the usage of DVDs, the first Nintendo console to feature optical media. In a classic Nintendo move, Nintendo used a proprietary mini-DVD format in order to curb piracy. It's a similar mindset to the Dreamcast GD-ROMs, using a proprietary disc format in an attempt to lower costs and thwart pirates, though it is technically better from a security standpoint because of its smaller physical size being harder to replicate. This had its own amount of downsides, however, as because of its smaller physical size, that meant that its storage size was equally as small, which made it harder for third-party companies to warrant porting their games over to the Cube, and the ones that did often had to stretch out their games across multiple disks of data. Plus, the smaller form factor prevented multimedia features such as CDs and DVDs from being played on the system, which up to that point had become a standard for game consoles. So, by all means, the GameCube was relatively successful when it came to stopping pirates, but at what cost? Clearly, not that much. Apart from these two consoles though, there weren't a lot of interesting things happening in the 6th generation and beyond when it comes to anti-piracy. Apart from the standard ways of checking to see if a disk is pirated or not, most anti-piracy measures were put onto the disk and game itself, and by the 7th generation these formulas were long perfected to the point where, even today, without some big security vulnerability being found within a console like the Wii, most game consoles require some form of external modification and homebrewing for piracy to work correctly. So I guess this is where we kind of plateau when it comes to console anti-piracy. Doesn't really get much better than this. But I've neglected to mention what happens when a pirate wins. What happens when a pirate is successful at cracking a console's security? You see, I've only talked about how consoles handled piracy, not games, and there's a distinction there. Because if the console's anti-piracy is somehow bypassed, then it's up to the games themselves to handle pirates. Back in the NES and SNES era, the common form of this were, once again, checksums. But if those checksums failed, then the game would have to prevent the player from going on any further, and a common prevention method were anti-piracy screens. I'll admit it, these weren't really anything particularly special. Usually I'd just display an error message, more often than not a blank or colored screen with some text on it, or maybe the game over screen or something entirely different for extra flavor. And it wasn't just used for stopping pirates either, but was also occasionally used if something was wrong with the cartridge or hardware, which you'd be more likely to see since costly pirating hardware was the only real way of encountering these actual anti-piracy screens. So, for all intents and purposes, these are boring. The main reason why I bring these up, however, is because of the influx of fake anti-piracy screens that were popular on YouTube a few years ago. Spurred on by a very well-made yet pretty obviously fake anti-piracy screen for Mario Party DS uploaded by Joey Perleone, these began making the rounds on YouTube back in 2021 for games like Super Mario 64 or Rayman Raving Rabbids. These vary in quality but generally have a lot of things in common. A slightly creepy still image of some of the game's main characters, some text that says something along the lines of, "Illegal copy detected, please turn off your system immediately and report this copy or else Mario will kill you in real life," followed by a fake phone number or website. Some of these will really amp up the horror aspect of it, essentially becoming creepypasta or screamer videos, but I have an appreciation for those that are creepy in more subtle ways, and I say this because, in a weird and subtle way, anti-piracy screens can be pretty creepy since it messes with the player's expectations. I mean, just imagine this hypothetical scenario. You're a hypothetical child in the hypothetical year of 1996 who just got home from a hypothetical... what trees? And you've just acquired a hypothetical copy of the long-awaited Donkey Kong Country 3. Excited, you pop it into your hypothetical Super Nintendo and hypothetically turn it on, only to be, by some hypothetical miracle, met with this. It's an unnerving scenario to say the least, especially as a hypothetical young child. It's such a stark contrast that you'd expect out of a game like Donkey Kong Country 3. Instead of a colorful monkey platformer, you're instead met with a eerie game over screen talking about unauthorized copies and some very urgent sounding music to boot. It's this juxtaposition that makes anti-piracy screens truly creepy. Especially when you get ones that talk about committing a serious crime. It does a great job at letting you, the player, know that something is deeply wrong and you might be the culprit. That's not a good feeling to have as a hypothetical child. Which is why I think fake anti-piracy screens can do a good job of being creepy. Take the Mario Party DS one, since it checks all the boxes. It's got a slightly creepy still image, not unlike the one found in DKC3, talks about committing a serious crime, and is accompanied by some equally urgent sounding music. Or this Super Mario 64 one, which features no music at all, which can sometimes be just as scary. But when you overdo it with the horror, it becomes less realistic and less unnerving as a result. It doesn't feel like I made a serious mistake by putting the game in, and more like I'm getting ready to watch Squidward's suicide. So, anti-piracy screens were at one point a relatively common way of letting the pirate know that, hey, what you're doing ain't cool. Cut it out. But I'm more interested in the games that act a little more devious when it comes to their anti-piracy. Games that may seem to work correctly under the circumstances, but soon become nigh on unbearable for any pirate playing them. These methods were pioneered in the NES era, where instead of displaying an anti-piracy message, something within the game would be removed if it detected a copied game was being played, preventing any progress from being made. Over time though, these things started to get more sophisticated and fucky. Just to name a few, GTA 4 makes the player drunk and permanently throttles the player's car, among other things. Spirit Tracks makes it impossible to go anywhere on the train, making the game unplayable after a certain point. Sonic Adventure 2 will cause Eggman in one of his levels to repeatedly fall through the floor over and over again, can't blame him. Super Smash Bros. Causes various elements of the game, such as knockback and player movement to malfunction. Mirror's Edge disables sprinting, Game Dev Tycoon forces the player's company to go under because of piracy, and the DS version of Michael Jackson's The Experience causes the game to be overwhelmed by Vuvuzela sound, reminiscent of the ones used in the 2010. I could go on and on. But one of the premier examples of anti-piracy that screws with the player is Earthbound. For a game like it, it is weirdly extensive with just how many checks there are in the game, 5 in total. The first check is for region locking, which if tripped, simply displays an error message, while the second one is for directly stopping pirates, which displays a more specific anti-piracy screen, serious crimes included. The next number of checks are insidious in subtle ways. The first 2 checks somehow get bypassed, and the game will start increasing the number of enemies that can spawn in an area to an insane degree, sometimes spawning enemies not even meant to be there or outright glitched enemies, designed to make the game way harder and in some circumstances crash the game. The 4th check does absolutely nothing, but the 5th and final check is arguably the worst, as if you somehow bypass all of the checks and make it to the very end of the game, right before the final boss fight, the game resets, and all of your save data is gone. Now, I don't really get the point of letting the player get to the very end of a game before kicking in the anti-piracy, since even if their experience was far different than a regular copy, they'd still be able to experience most of the game without paying. But nonetheless, Earthbound's copy protection is one of the most infamous anti-piracy schemes out there, arguably second only to Spyro the Dragon. One of the main mascots of the PlayStation 1 era of Sony, Insomniac really hit it out of the park with the first 3 games of the series. Just the first 3. None of the others. And the 3rd game of the series, Year of the Dragon, is notable for just how comprehensive its anti-piracy measures are. As one of the later PS1 games that introduced more extensive copy protection, its checks and balances go far more in depth than the other usual PS1 games. In addition to the extra mod chip protection put in place when the game boots up, the game features some sneaky anti-piracy that will only kick in once the game has been cracked and enough time has passed so the pirate thinks everything is working fine. After this, an ominous warning will befall onto the player by Zoe the Fairy, which is the catalyst for everything in the game to slowly start falling apart before the player's eyes. The effects of Spyro 3 anti-piracy include gems in a level slowly disappearing, eggs you've collected going away, forcing you to recollect them, things in a level not working as they should or suddenly breaking, the pause menu functionality disappearing, portals taking you to different or incorrect locations, Sparks' health can start going down, in PAL versions the language of the game can change suddenly, the game is especially susceptible to soft blocking, and by far the most devious protection this game has in place. Once you reach the final boss, the game will reset itself back to Sunrise Spring, with all of your progress wiped completely. While Earthbound's anti-piracy was extensive, this is the first anti-piracy with which I could say it is actively malicious towards the player. Now, some of these things in isolation would be pretty annoying, but not that bad. Disappearing eggs, just go back to collect the ones that you've lost. No pause menu, no problem. The game autosaves anyways. Game changes languages on you, now would be as good as time as ever to crack out the Duolingo. But all of these things happening at once ensures that the player has the most miserable time as possible playing this game, and honestly, I respect the hell out of Insomniac for doing that. Leave it up to Spyro to give pirates the blatant middle finger, I suppose. So far, we've seen heaps of ways in which game companies try to thwart pirates, as successful or unsuccessful as they may be. But even still, as rampant as anti-piracy can be, pirates are always one step ahead, constantly finding new ways to circumvent constant security and getting their greedy hands on developers' precious work. So, if none of these are successful, then what is? Well, I think I've narrowed it down. Somewhat. These are the 4 definitive-ish ways I've devised in which companies can stop pirates while still making sure they make a profit off their games. Solution 1. Just lower the prices? Yeah, I know I just said making sure game companies make a profit, but one of the main reasons why people pirate video games is that gaming is just an expensive hobby. What with newer games pushing upwards of $70 to $80 now, and older games going for twice as much more. And with consoles also getting more and more expensive and tariffs, which might make everything worse, it's easy to see why people choose to pirate video games instead of shelling out hundreds of dollars to play Mario. By lowering the price of games, you can open the doors for so many people to finally be able to experience the games they'd never be able to afford otherwise, and sales on some of these games are sure to skyrocket as a result. There are a few caveats. Mainly that, as expensive as games are to buy, they cost far more to make. So a game like Mario Kart World being $80 is stupid, of course, but you gotta understand that the cost of making it probably cost millions more, so it's natural that game developers would want to make up some of their losses on developing these games. Now, you could always wait for price drops or sales, or even wait until used copies start circulating, which isn't a bad idea, but some game companies are really stingy when it comes to this. Nintendo is especially bad, since a lot of Nintendo Switch games will still sell for full price years after release, and apart from a few exceptions, stay that way. And other game companies like Microsoft have historically been against used games, which they've thankfully backed down on. So if lowering the price of games won't work, then what else can we turn to? Solution 2. Make your games more accessible to the masses. This is mainly in regards to older games that are more likely for people to pirate because they're out of circulation and, depending on the title, can be ludicrously expensive. And even though companies aren't going to see profits off of these older titles, some of them can be really defensive about it, especially ones like Nintendo. Why is it always Nintendo? So if game companies really have this much of a problem with emulator sites and old game piracy, then by making them more readily available, then theoretically piracy should go down. And this is something that Sony, Microsoft, and Nintendo have already been doing in some capacity. Sony with PS Classics and PS Plus, Microsoft with Game Pass and backwards compatibility, hey, I should make a video on that, and Nintendo with Nintendo Classics on NSO. So it's not like game companies are averse to making their older games playable on modern platforms. Quite the contrary, actually. But since most of these are subscription-based, it might not be the most appealing option to those who are looking to play some of these for cheap. Some consoles do have virtual console-esque systems. Nintendo used to do it with the Wii to Wii U, and Microsoft and Sony have options like it, although some PlayStation games are only available to download with PS Plus, which stinks. So by that logic, problem solved, right? With game libraries as diverse as some of these older consoles, it's pretty much impossible to port every single one from them to a newer console. That's why most companies just focus on the bigger hitting games from past generations, instead of more obscure stuff, or licensed titles that would be a nightmare to port over. There's also the issue of exclusive games, since as long as game companies want money, certain games are always going to be released for one console only. So even though there may be some exceptions to this over the past few years, making these titles more accessible is probably not going to cut it. So if all else fails, then solution 3. Fuck it. Be so aggressive with your anti-piracy that pirates won't even think about pirating your games ever again. Scare them, sue them, make playing your games as nightmarish as possible if need be. Hell, if push comes to shove, just kill them. They're pirates, it doesn't matter. I say this as a joke, but it goes without saying that piracy is a crime. Copyright infringement is no joke after all, so it's natural that game companies would want to prevent it from being widespread. But sometimes it just feels like they're overdoing it, man. I mean, I just got done talking about how aggressive Nintendo can be with ROM sites and whatnot, and emulators like Bleem and companies like Tengen have dealt with genuine court cases over alleged copyright infringement. So, as much as I hate to admit it, game companies are always going to take a very no-tolerance approach to anti-piracy. And even if anti-piracy wasn't as virulent as it was in the past, pirates are still a widespread issue for game companies, which brings me to my final topic. Give up. Acknowledge that piracy is a natural part of life for pretty much all forms of media and move on. Realistically, there isn't that much that can be done to thwart pirates 100%. You can hinder them, that's for sure, but they will always find a way, so why bother? Instead of attacking pirates head-on, you could stop piracy in different ways, such as encouraging pirates to raise awareness for the game or adopting a pay-what-you-want model. You more so see these with smaller indie games, games that you shouldn't be pirating in the first place, but also games that need as much support as they can get otherwise. There's a reason why you don't see this stuff as much with AAA games. If the game isn't an immediate flop, then chances are it'll do more than good to not warrant messages like these. But for smaller game companies, they deserve a chance at making it in the gaming industry, so it's easy to see why they take a less aggressive approach to piracy. For larger game companies, this is the most unlikely option, unfortunately. Game companies aren't going to stop with their anti-piracy for a million years, and we all know this. Because as long as piracy remains a problem in their eyes, anti-piracy is still going to be a mainstay in the gaming zeitgeist for however long. So, for the foreseeable future, anti-piracy is going to always be a part of the gaming zeitgeist, and there's likely not much to be done against this. This isn't to say there aren't measures against anti-piracy, anti-piracy so to speak, but you do run the risk of potential legal problems. It is a crime after all. But after all is said and done, it's easy to see why developers would want anti-piracy to be implemented in the first place. In a world where massive developer layoffs have become commonplace and games like Concord can shut down after only 2 weeks, it's natural that developers would want to see positive returns on the stuff they make, lest their jobs be taken away from them. So it's important to recognize that anti-piracy does serve a purpose. Whether or not it works is another story. It just seems as if more and more these days, game companies don't have developers in mind when they enact some of these anti-piracy policies, and are more apt to screw over innocent users just in case they so much as think about stealing that copy of Michael Jackson's The Experience for the Nintendo DS. Well, the joke's on them because I bought it used.